as far as the actual importance of philosophy, the discipline started by trying to answer the question, what is a good life? At least as the early philosophers thought about it, every other question that we ask should be in service of answering that initial question. For the most part, it needs to be do more philosophy. When you learn how to think when you get a training in philosophy, which perhaps unsurprisingly, is applicable to a lot of different areas.
My guest today is Dr. Sean Meslar, a graduate of the University of Georgia in Athens and a teacher of philosophy. I hope you enjoy.
I am a Charlottesville native, so from here. Um, I stayed here through high school. Charlottesville's really hometown at every point in my life. Went to undergraduate at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, and then from there went straight to graduate school, the PhD program at the University of Georgia. Once I wrapped up there, I came back here.
Cool. So, why did you decide to, I guess, what was your introduction to philosophy? Because that's what you decided to study, correct? So, what was your introduction?
Fittingly for what I'm doing now, which is teaching philosophy at a high school level, I had the opportunity to take a high school philosophy class at Western Albemarle, where I was a student. And from probably a couple of weeks into the class, I was absolutely hooked. Loved the discipline. Couldn't really see myself doing anything else, so I stuck with it. I was one of very, very few students who came in as a declared philosophy major into my undergraduate program, and I've stuck with it all the way since.
Yeah. And did you have a dream? What did you want to be when you were, a kid? Everybody has a dream that they have. What did you see yourself doing?
Um, I had before interest in philosophy, I had a leaning towards the argumentative professions, so still a pretty good fit there. I think in terms of more mainstream professions, maybe being a lawyer was probably the best fit for that. One of those people who always told me, "You'd make a good lawyer, you're good at arguing." So, um, not anything major in terms of like being an astronaut or any of the typical things, but yeah.
Yeah. So you said you went to school in Georgia.
Yeah, graduate program at the
Okay.
University of Georgia in Athens.
What made you choose Georgia?
It was not the most uplifting story. I sent out as many applications as I could afford, which is typically the advice we give to students applying to graduate school in philosophy. I mostly got rejections, got a couple of acceptances, but the University of Georgia my was the one place that offered me a graduate assistantship, so I would get a tuition waiver there while being able to teach, which I wanted to teach anyway. And when you knock off however many tens of thousands of dollars in tuition, it ultimately made it a pretty easy choice.
Yeah, I think that's a great choice, especially how expensive school is now. I think you made the
Yeah.
right call. Yeah, for sure. So you go and you start studying philosophy. Did you have what was your long-term plan? Was it specifically to teach philosophy, or did you have something else in mind?
Yeah, that was it, to teach philosophy. From a professional standpoint, that's pretty much it as far as any professional preparation or training that you're going to get at a philosophy graduate school is how to teach, and the other scholarly sides. So I haven't gone into that level of scholarship where I'm doing research and publications. I've done a little bit here and there, but mostly, yeah, the ambition was to teach. Just nothing is more fun to me than just being able to come in and talk about philosophy, and that's what you're able to do as a philosophy teacher. So
Yeah, and I think one of the one of the stereotypes with a philosophy degree is that you're not going to be able to do anything with it.
yep.
um, but if I'm not mistaken, lots of lawyers score, or lots of people who take philosophy score very highly on exams to become a lawyer. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you look across the board, I think philosophy is maybe number two in average LSAT scores, behind either economics or engineering, something with an E, and generally very high standardized test scores, highest on the medical school admission test, highest on GRE verbal, highest on GMAT. So when you learn how to think when you get a training in philosophy, which perhaps unsurprisingly, is applicable to a lot of different areas.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a a good thing to start to emphasize is that there is lots of stuff that you can do with philosophy, outside of just improving your life, but career wise, there's things to do,
Yeah,
for sure.
it's a hard thing to be critical of. You know, people hear philosophy and they have that sort of initial response. Oh, what are you going to do with that? But when you actually explain what philosophy is, like, well, you're able to think about problems and think through them in a logical way. It it sounds a little more ridiculous to be critical of that. Like, thinking, that's no good, right? In the end, I think the sort of skills that you get from studying philosophy are applicable to pretty much anything. You'll need more training coming in if you're talking about entering into a specific field, but just a generalized intelligence is going to put you in good stead no matter where you end up.
Yeah, absolutely. So after you graduate college, what steps did you take after that?
Um, Undergraduate or graduate school?
Graduate school.
Uh, not not the most uplifting chapter of my life. The academic job market is just brutal. So I spent pretty much a full year sending at live being a job applicant. That was my full time job. Um, so going around different places, interviews, sending out tons and tons of applications, writing cover letters, etc. Um, I don't recommend it, but I'm content with where I ended up, just sort of by happenstance more than anything else, ending up in the position that I have now, um, through not entirely direct means, and ending up in a position where I can teach philosophy at the high school level.
Yeah, and so you're teaching at Monticello now.
Yep.
Okay, and how have you been liking it?
It's it's good. It's a little bit different from teaching at the college level, even though it's technically a dual enrollment class, so students are getting course credit. Um, at the college level, students are a little more willing to take the reins in terms of just showing up and talking, which is sort of the basis of a discussion based course. High school students are still a little tentative in terms of class meeting and how it progresses. They want to be more led along in terms of here's a question, answer this. Have you thought about this? When you consider from this angle, what do you think? And sort of a more direct and guided pace to class structure. So it's been a little different as a departure from my preferred teaching style, but still a lot of fun to get that initial perspective. It's always a lot of fun to introduce kids to arguments in philosophy that they haven't thought about before and that challenge sort of some preconceived notions that they have out there. That kind of mix of frustration and surprise of like, yeah, I never thought about this. I don't really like it, but I don't know how to argue against it. It's always a fun feeling to kind of push people along that path as an educator.
Yeah, yeah. And so speaking to that, I mean, philosophy is a process, right? It's a huge learning curve to it. So I think it's probably easy to get frustrated. So yeah, I'd imagine it's a process to get to the point where you can feel
Yeah,
comfortable.
the way I structure this course that I'm teaching now in particular is it's a little disjointed to the students in that I actually start the class just by talking about logic. So I spend a couple of weeks in the class saying, like, we're not actually doing philosophy yet. What we're talking about is the kind of vocabulary and concepts that you need first to learn before you can even like start to talk about these arguments in a productive way. So we talk about validity, fallacies, and different concepts of truth, things like that, just to kind of get that vocabulary introduced to them so they can then actually start doing the real business of philosophy. If you just threw people in and started throwing esoteric arguments at them right off the bat, you wouldn't get much purchase, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. So why do you think philosophy is important? Why should people learn philosophy?
Uh, Philosophy is kind of indebted to the most important questions. So whatever it is that we really need to figure out is ultimately what philosophy should be asking. Um, there's of course a lot of further branches of academia where people just kind of drift off to the outer fringes of like at what point does something a question we often have is like what makes up a heap, how much stuff do you have to take away from a heap to have it not be a heap anymore. Strange questions like that, but as far as the actual importance of philosophy, the discipline started by trying to answer the question, what is a good life? And at least as the early philosophers thought about it, every other question that we ask should be in service of answering that initial question. So it's an easy discipline, I think, to defend on the whole, because what we're trying to figure out is just the very most basic questions of our existence. How do we live a good life? What makes for a good life? What can we know? What can we not know? If we don't answer those questions, we might be happy, but not in the same complete and fulfilled sense that you could be with the sort of philosophical life, I think.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I've been very much just getting introduced to philosophy, and I've just found a sudden, I guess, love for it, and specifically Stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been sort of working my way through a lot of the more famous works. I've got the meditations right here that I've been
Uh-huh.
reading, and I've read a John Sellers book. I think it's John Sellers. That's an intro to Stoicism, and it sort of seems like there's at least in my mind, there's sort of the bigger questions, the more I don't want to say unnecessary, but questions about like what is the universe, what is the cosmos, what are we, things like that that sort of seem less related to living a good life. And then Stoicism seems very, I guess, pragmatic, or how do we live with
Right.
according to nature on Earth. So what is the? How can we? How do those big, huge questions? How do those questions help us live a good life? How do those benefit us?
So one of the big Stoic uh, authors out there, the one for whom Stoicism was actually named, uh, Epictetus, or Epictetus, names pronounced some different ways. Um, what he talked about in his most famous book, The Enchiridion, was this kind of hierarchy of questions that first we need to be asking, what is it that I need to do to live a good life? And that's where you're going to hear most of your main tenets of Stoic philosophy. This idea of controlling what you can control and not worrying about what you can't control. And then he said, we have other questions out there, questions about like the sort of bigger questions. What is the nature of the universe? Who are the gods, or are there gods? And these are questions that can come into play, but questions that we're ultimately only interested in asking or answering to the extent that they inform how we live a good life. The nature of reality is going to determine in part what we need to do and how we need to live our lives because it affects us. And then, even lower than that, he said there's a third tier of questions that we still need to answer, which are questions about what makes for a good argument, essentially questions of logic. So we still need to answer those questions. Those questions about logic and what makes for a good argument will inform the second tier of questions. So now we can get information about what the world is, um, the right way to live our lives, questions about metaphysics broadly. And then once we get answers to those questions, we'll finally be in a position to kind of answer the main questions, our primary concerns about living a good life. So, um, still being informed about why we need to answer these questions, but at the same time recognizing some of these questions are ultimately more important than others.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how do we? I guess how do we determine what questions are more important than others?
Well, what I think a lot of philosophers will say, just coming from the root of the term philosophia, the love of wisdom, is that the philosophical life, these profound investigations, are, as you said earlier, an activity into themselves. So you can't, I think, consistently be a philosopher and be interested or be committed to finding the answer to these questions simply because the track record of philosophy is abysmal in that regard, right? When students start taking an introduction to philosophy class, we have them read Plato, who's writing more than 2,000 years ago, still relevant to a philosophy class. You'd never see anything like that in a science class, for instance, where we're actually getting definitive answers and working off of what we found. In philosophy, it's as much, if not more, about, as you said, the process of asking those questions and the benefits to our own life that we get, not by answering the questions, but by asking them and thinking about them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. As I've been reading meditations, I think a lot of people who do read meditations feel that it's really repetitive. and Marcus kind of writes the same things over and over and over again. But it seems like it's because I guess he's practicing the
Right.
things and he's not really writing original thoughts. He's more just trying to. It's not really an original work, right? He's just kind of repeating the things to himself that he's trying to work on.
Yeah, they are
Um,
his meditations. So it makes sense if you think about it from that perspective, right? The things that he is working on doing or the mindset that he's working on achieving, it, even if you can write it down succinctly in a couple of paragraphs, that's not going to affect the life change that Stoicism is all about, right? Stoicism is one of those disciplines where you'll sometimes hear students say, "Well, yeah, it sounds really cool, but I don't think I could do it." Right? And Marcus Aurelius is the same as anyone else in that respect, that he can recognize the intuitive sense behind all the ideas of Stoicism, but it's still hard to adopt those principles legitimately from a psychological perspective. So you get something like the Meditations where he is working on it, and the book itself is us seeing the process of him working on it in his writing.
yeah. So that really is what being a student of philosophy is, right? Is specifically what the meditations is. That is a representation of being a student of philosophy.
Yeah, just the most one of the most famous quotes about sort of the nature of philosophy is from Aristotle, who says the beginning of philosophy is wonder. That it's we're just when we're open to these questions and we consider them, it's just this feeling that presses on us of like, oh my gosh, I never thought of this before, and the world kind of opens up to us. And maintaining that feeling of being open and having this feeling of wonder is kind of what drives us forward through the process of philosophy. If you lose that and you just, you become a logician or something like that, and you're just writing away on proofs that you don't really care about, that is pretty far divorced, to me at least, from the nature of what philosophy is really supposed to be.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, yeah, great. So I want to talk about some of the specific branches, I guess they're called, or specific. What would they be called? Specific.
Subdisciplines, maybe.
Exactly, sort of like ethics and logic and metaphysics, things like that. So, how did
Sure.
these subsects of philosophy get created?
Originally, philosophy was, um, I guess they're kind of two originally. So we have the pre-Socratics. So Socrates is doing pretty well for himself if there are pre-Socratics and him and everyone afterwards. But the pre-Socratic philosophers were what we now call natural philosophers, which were essentially the scientists of their day. So what they were doing was, in essence, what we would now call metaphysics, but not in the same sort of way. They usually came up with answers like everything in the world is fundamentally made up of water. So kind of the physicists of their time more so than philosophers, at least as we would think of them after the dawn of Socrates. The big shift in philosophy that Socrates brought about was in starting with questions of ethics. So the he was fundamentally interested in questions about what is a good life, and in particular asking questions about virtue. So a lot of the Platonic dialogues that feature Socrates will be specifically asking about one virtue. So what is the nature of piety? What is the nature of justice? And fittingly for the founder of the discipline, none of these questions ever really got answered. He would interview or talk with some notable figure in Athenian culture. He would assume that they would know something about the topic because they were notable figures, and it turned out they actually didn't know what they were talking about. In so doing, Socrates ended up making major political enemies and ultimately getting executed. We get more of an investigation into what we would now call metaphysics, starting with Plato and his student Aristotle. So these are attempts to explain kind of puzzles that we encounter just in thinking through issues philosophically. So, if we're saying that bravery is some broad concept, how is it that bravery as a concept relates to one particular brave act versus another brave act? How can we say that they're the same kind of thing while still maintaining the fact that they're different? So I think those sorts of puzzles, just about thinking conceptually or thinking about philosophically, bring rise to metaphysics broadly. Um, so at that point, we have ethics, we have metaphysics. I think epistemology comes significantly later in the history of philosophy. So the first major epistemologist, at least in the tradition that we're thinking, is Rene Descartes, who's around the time of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment era in Europe, where he really starts to question the sorts of things that we can know. So epistemology gets entered in the line there, and then the much smaller branches. Some would take offense to me saying that, but at least historically, smaller branches they kind of shoot up in very quick succession after the academic integration of philosophy. So with the rise of the university, you now have the means of sustaining way more philosophers than you would have in the earlier times. You would basically have to have another job or find a king that liked you, king or queen that liked you as a writer, to sustain your existence as a philosopher. Um, with the rise of the university, we now have people who are able to work in philosophy. So as a result, we get a lot more people working in philosophy, a much greater diversity of interests, and therefore an expansion into a lot more realms. So that nowadays there's a philosophy of just about everything: philosophy of mind, philosophy of race, philosophy of religion, philosophy of language. Whatever you want to talk about, there are philosophers who want to talk about it too in a philosophical way.
Yeah. So I heard you specifically talking about if a king wanted to hire or give a philosopher a job. That was kind of a prominent thing back in the day. And a lot of philosophers had issues with that because if they fell out of favor with them, then they could not only be out of a job, but some of them were out of, I mean, their life. They were exiled, right? So, which shows that people kind of take differently to philosophy. Some people have a great affinity to it, and some people not so much. It doesn't charm them immediately as much. And I see that when I'm sharing quotes with my friends, like, "Oh, look at this cool thing that Marcus Aurelius said." And some of them are immediately captivated, interested, and some of them are like, "Oh, yeah, that's cool," or whatever. So, how do you think? What do you think distinguishes, or what sort of creates that? Some people have an immediate interest, and some people don't. What draws the line there?
It is hard for me to say, of course, given that I'm so far to one side on the pro philosophy side, and I just not to be too critical of other disciplines, but when I think of other people working in other fields, I'm like, how can you do anything but philosophy when the questions we're considering are so obviously important to me? What I hear most often is that, in line with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, that philosophy just isn't practical. That there's a quote at the end of Voltaire's book Candide, where he has a character who's a philosopher who's going on and talking about this obscure argument about how this is the best of all possible worlds. And the main character of the book is more or less like, yeah, okay, whatever, but I still need to feed my sheep. Like, I need to live my life regardless of what you're saying. It doesn't change the reality that I face in the day to day. And I think that if anything, it has to be that just there's a feeling out there that no matter there's some connection with philosophy and sophistry, that there are some people who work in philosophy that are just ill-intentioned or not exactly forthcoming with their intentions, and that they just sort of argue for the sake of arguing or argue for the sake of seeing what clever arguments they can come up with without ever actually caring about how philosophy is going to connect with what people are actually doing.
Yeah. So as those new branches of philosophy are being created through time, are they still all concerned with this same theme of creating a good life? Because I feel like some of the questions that I hear in philosophy is just kind of out there and obscure, and it seems like it's so branched off around the tree that I don't really see how you get to the base of that. So do any of them some of them just don't really seem related. So are they still is all philosophy still concerned with how do we create a good life, or are there other underlying intentions behind it?
I would say at this point, particularly in the academic world, that it would be a real stretch to say that all philosophy is. I think maybe the slight emendation we could make would be to say all philosophers are still concerned with these questions. They still interest us. But certainly, if you think about some of the subdisciplines, I need to give a hard time to what's known as mereology, which is the study in philosophy of the relation between parts and wholes. So, like, you have a car. If it loses a tire, is it still the same car? If you keep taking parts out of it, at what point does it stop being a car? Those are questions that people research with a high degree of devotion and intensity. I think without ever particularly caring or knowing how that's going to relate back to anything that really motivated the start of philosophy. And it was a bit of a I wouldn't say crisis, but an existential question about philosophy as other disciplines kind of advanced and sprouted out from philosophy, and in the way that you could even say most academic disciplines have. What is that's unique about philosophy? It doesn't seem like it's a subject matter. Usually philosophers will say that it's more about a methodology than anything else that kind of unifies philosophy or ties everything together. That it's a way of asking questions and a way of approaching a subject matter without presumptions, that is kind of distinctive of philosophy and what still keeps it all together, rather than a particular content question or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So cool. So as far as Stoicism specifically, we have there's lots of different writing from different philosophers, but they're all kind of different, and none of them are really, well, not none of them, many of them are not really what we would think of when we think of traditional book. Um, Sort of Epictetus has discourses that are written by one of his students, and Seneca has letters, and obviously Marcus has his journal. So, how do we determine what is and what isn't a Stoic or a specific philosophical writing?
It's an interesting question, and what we're used to treating as a philosophical work now is actually pretty foreign to how philosophy would have started before the Stoics. Most of Plato's works were through dialogues, so written very much like a play where you have multiple characters, they're in conversation with each other. Notoriously, all we have left are the writings of Aristotle, who's kind of the other major early historical philosopher, are essentially his lecture notes. So they're very in depth, and engaging works to read in one sense in terms of the ideological complexity, but they're not actually works that, in the same way as someone's letters, or Marcus Aurelius's journaling, they're not works that were intended for direct public access. It's just a quirk of history as to what's been left to us and what we have access to. But I think Stoicism in particular uh, is kind of defined by this trait that it's not what we would call an academic philosophy. It's not the sort of approach to philosophy that is best treated by an abstract essay, because that's what Stoics were ultimately rejecting, saying that philosophy is not about the abstract questions; it's about practical stuff. We answer these abstract questions only in an attempt to service the practical questions. So I think it makes sense very fittingly for the discipline or the sort of area of inquiry itself to say that we now have works that are coming to us that are practical. They're people, their letters, their correspondence, their journaling, things like that. I think is a fitting relic of what Stoicism is, ideologically speaking.
Yeah. So would the philosophers of the past, would they have thought of themselves as philosophers in the same way that, I mean, people do now, or would they just see themselves as a businessman who also, reads philosophy and studies philosophy, or an emperor who studies philosophy? Would they see themselves, were there philosophers that saw themselves in the same way as full-time philosophers, or was it always a supplement to their daily life?
There were certainly some people who were committed to it full time. So I think there would be some common ground in terms of interests. They'd be happy to have a conversation with these people, these professors of philosophy. But I think the idea of professional philosophy itself, um, that you would do philosophy for a living, is something that would be very foreign, even to philosophers going into the early Middle Ages, and even the early modern period. you see some reaction in terms of historical text about people being concerned about philosophy being practiced in universities because they have fears about kind of inherent censorship, that once you start integrating yourself and the practice of your philosophy into government institutions, that you can't still maintain the same degree of autonomy that they felt at least was characteristic of philosophy. You were doing your own thing, thinking for yourself. That they had concerns that you would really be able to do that if you made philosophy your profession.
Yeah. And so there were some people who spoke and taught philosophy, but didn't apply it to their life. Correct? Was it
Right,
sophists?
sophists. Yeah. So
Sophists.
what we see in Plato's early writings, where he's, at least most scholars say, where he's most directly trying to convey what Socrates had to think. Um, Socrates took great care to distinguish himself from sophists. One of the charges that was brought against him that ultimately led to his execution was that he was a teacher. And what he says in his own defense was that he has people who essentially follow him around and listen to what he has to say, but he makes a specific point of not taking any money from anyone, because he wants to separate himself from what sophists do, which was essentially to make orators out of young men. So they would come, they would study with the sophists, they would learn arguments not for the sake of genuine inquiry, but just for the sake of building up a rhetorical ability. Socrates wanted to do the opposite, so he would have people follow him around. They would, attend conversations that he would have with people, but he wouldn't take any money from them because he claimed personally not to have any philosophical knowledge. So he said he had nothing to teach them. So I think very early on we see a distinction between philosophy as practiced genuinely and the kind of ill-intentioned attempts at using the tools of philosophy or of logic specifically to ill ends, specifically monetary gains.
Yeah, and I think to just be completely honest, that's kind of something that maybe we still have going on going on now on social media and politics and things like that. So how do we distinguish between somebody that would be would we consider a philosopher, somebody who I guess practices what they preach a little more and are really about it, and a sophist? How do we determine who's really about what they're saying and who's not?
Uh, for the most part, it needs to be do more philosophy. So, engage these people in conversation. If we take up the same methodology that Socrates did, he spent a lot of time talking to these sophists, uh, and making enemies of them ultimately because he wanted to talk to them about philosophy and he wanted them to demonstrate the knowledge that they claimed to have, but they weren't able to back themselves up when they were really faced with the substance of philosophy rather than kind of the show behind it. So in the same vein, if we are presented with disingenuous arguments in public discourse that seem intelligent or seem persuasive, if we respond to it in kind with legitimate, genuine philosophy, then I think at least the hope has to be that we can tell the difference between the two through that process of discourse, back and forth, investigation.
Yeah, I agree. Um, I think it's getting harder and harder to get in contact with the people we're voting for, or
Or even to
um,
have a conversation. The
yeah,
the prospect of raising an objection to someone or saying, "Hey, have you thought about this?" is less and less likely to get an answer as opposed to just getting blocked or getting death threats or things along those lines.
yeah. But I think it's something that we need, and that's sort of one of the reasons I think I've been attracted to philosophy specifically. Is it seems kind of polar opposite to a lot of the things that we'd see in politics or yeah, stuff like that. So that's sort of what I get from it. Um, so cool. I want to know some specific works, books, specific philosophers that maybe you got introduced first that you would recommend for other people to check out.
So I think my very favorite philosopher to read is Arthur Schopenhauer. He's just a very gifted writer. Um, he's approachable. He's incredibly intelligent in a way that he's not shy about showing. So he has a very high opinion of himself. But the guy was an absolute genius. He had Greek, Latin, German, English, French, Spanish, and he uses quotes from authors in their native tongue all throughout his works, and is prone to go on these diatribes against philosophers that he doesn't like. That really shows how he's feeling in a not disingenuous way. So he wasn't, I think, in terms of historical influence, the most famous, but he does a really good job of writing and making complex ideas more accessible. In particular, for the other philosopher that I would include on this list, for Immanuel Kant, who, for my money, smartest person who ever lived, but is not at all approachable in terms of his writing style. So I think the aspiration should be Kant. I I find his work very persuasive in a lot of different areas that just have made some pretty fundamental changes in how I think about the world and how I live. So I recommend Kant to everyone, but not at first. When I first read his work, I found it totally incomprehensible and off-putting. So the two of them for sure. A lot of the early modern epistemologists, so John Locke, David Hume, Rene Descartes, all these are well translated at this point, accessible works. In particular, if you're someone who's interested in politics, the influence of John Locke is hard to overstate. If you read his second treatise on government, is essentially the U.S. Constitution, with a few changes made, so as it not to seem entirely like plagiarism, but hugely influential there. Most of Plato's early dialogues, I think, for someone who's just starting in philosophy, are great. They're accessible. They're humorous. Socrates is a pretty entertaining character, and they very much show, I think, the core methodology of philosophy: asking a question, considering answers, getting back to that same question. Um, in terms of contemporary philosophers writing, there are too many, I think, to pick. Any of the big names. One of my personal favorites is Jen Lackey, but I think with academic philosophers nowadays, you really need to have some introduction into the subject field before you just jump in to start reading papers that are published in contemporary academic philosophy. So lots of great authors working out there, but I would start with some of the big names in the history of philosophy as well. So Plato, Schopenhauer, Hume, Locke, Descartes, and Kant, I think, are all some of the biggest names out there that definitely merit visiting.
Yeah. And as far as living a better life, would you say those are also the same philosophers that have helped you personally?
Yeah, I would say so. In some cases, if you read a work, you'll need to engage with the author's broader corpus, we would say. So you're not just going to get the full picture if you just read an excerpt from Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. There are interesting portions there, but to really get a sense of the whole thing, which I think those philosophers were still trying to do at that point, answer philosophy broadly, there's a lot of reading involved. So you can skim around here and there, but if you do want to get the whole sense, it does take a lot of reading, but it is there to be found.
Yeah. So as far as philosophical works, I think a lot of the ones that people immediately reach for are what we would call Western philosophy, I guess, or Western philosophy is a lot of the most popular. Have you done any reading in lots of Eastern philosophy or anything like that?
I haven't done a lot. I've included some in some courses that I've taught before. One in particular that I would recommend is the Tao Te Ching. It's the not especially approachable to someone who is well set in sort of a Western philosophical logical approach. It's a book that's riddled with contradictions and embraces them, but it's a very meditative work, I would say, in its own right, in terms of its consideration of what the fundamental nature of the universe is. So the Tao Te Ching for sure. Works in Hinduism, anything that deals with their conception of the non-dual nature of self, this idea, tattvam asat, that thou art, that fundamentally everything is the same thing, and that we're all just kind of aspects of it. Those are all fascinating works. The one that I read in a course of mine that I taught was the Bhagavad Gita, but there are lots of options there, particularly in epistemology. Hindu scholars produced some really great work that was, well ahead of what philosophers in the West were working on at that time. And then I think Buddhism as well. I had talked about Arthur Schopenhauer as one of my favorite philosophers. He said of his own philosophy that it was essentially just a philosophically explained version of Buddhism, but that they had really latched on to the truth of what reality was long before he had kind of put it into better wording. Is essentially all he took credit for. So I think just the very basic sutras of Buddhism, anything that you can get in those regards, talking about the nature of the self, the nature of reality, are all very, very engaging.
Yeah. So with all these great works available, how do we get people excited to read them? How do we get people excited to delve into philosophy? Because I imagine that's something you have to do when you're in students with your students and in school. Students come in some days and they might be grumpy, but you still got to teach them. So how can we get people excited to be interested and delve into philosophy?
To go back to the quote from Aristotle that I mentioned earlier, he says the beginning of philosophy is wonder. That's, I think, something of a misused quote, because the more literal translation of the word that he uses for wonder is kind of like, it's not like, oh wow, that's so cool. It's like, oh my gosh, what do I, like, it's an overwhelmed feeling, kind of, that we're presented with these problems that we don't have answers to, and we need to solve them to kind of just get to a comfortable mental space. So similarly to the beginning methodology of Socrates, who himself described himself as a gadfly, his job was to go around and annoy people, to present them with these problems that they had to consider. I think that's really the best way, maybe not the way to stir up the most positive feelings about it, but the best way to get people thinking philosophically is to present them with the problems that we spend so much time considering, because there are no easy answers to those problems. And they're problems that we do want answers to. So if you can present those problems to people, get them out of their comfort zone, they can't help but start thinking philosophically, even if they don't want to. They need, we have a natural desire for intellectual closure as humans. We're going to start thinking about those questions if we're presented with the problems. So ask questions and get people thinking, I think is the way to get everyone started on the road to philosophy.
Yeah. It seems like everyone is so distracted, though. I mean, there's so much in life that we have to deal with that can kind of take away from the things that we maybe actually care about subconsciously, but we don't fully realize it. We'd rather try to get a high-paying job in some field we don't care about rather than, pursuing something that we really want to do just because we want to conform and we want to be accepted, and all these things that kind of compound to make people just do maybe something they don't want to do. So it can be hard, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Is just if you can maybe spark that interest in people through asking them questions and maybe making them realize that they're not doing what they want to do, or making them realize there's better answers to the issues that they have. That makes a ton of sense.
And
Um,
in line with how we've been talking earlier, with some of the early philosophers, philosophy doesn't have to be a dominant lifestyle. You can do just about anything and still think philosophically, and that's really all the discipline demands of you. So it's not as if everyone needs to quit their jobs and become philosophy professors. It's what we want as philosophers is, as you do whatever it is you do, that you think in a philosophical way.
yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. So I found a article by you potentially. Transworld depravity and divine omniscience. Is that you?
Yes, it's a mouthful.
Is that your dissertation?
No, that's a publication that I got a couple of years before I finished my dissertation. So it was a modified version of a term paper that I had written for a philosophy of religion class.
Okay. I didn't have a chance to read it, but I saw some interesting things. Something else, the question of evil was something
Mhm.
that came up about it. Can you tell me a little more about it?
Sure, but be careful what you wish for. You know, when people when they start getting going, they can be a little hard to rein in. So I'll do my best to try and keep it brief. Um, Within philosophy of religion, there's a particularly big question known as the problem of evil, which is one of the earliest and most common questions that theists consider. If there's a God who's all powerful and all knowing, why does evil exist? It seems like God should be able to stop it. The paper that I wrote is within the literature about that question. It looks at a particularly sophisticated version of what's known as the free will defense, which is by far the most popular defense on behalf of theism to this question. So the answer to the question is, at least as the free will defender puts it, we have free will. Evil exists as the result of the exercise of free will, and that's why God can't prevent evil from happening. Because if God stopped us from exercising our free will, we wouldn't have free will, and as a result, we wouldn't have any moral goodness either. So my essay is an objection to that response, in essence, saying that if we are free beings, and God has foreknowledge, God is all knowing, so God knows exactly what we're going to do in the future. That there's a fundamental inconsistency there, that we can't both be free and God knows what we're going to do, which is in itself another issue that's been explored pretty heavily in the philosophy of religion. It's just an attempt to kind of connect the two as an objection to what's known as the free will defense. So this attempts to explain the existence of evil as a result of human free will is to me ultimately unsatisfactory.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I finagled a PDF of it, so I'm gonna read it. And if I don't understand it the first time, I guess I'll go and learn some more, and then come back and figure it out again.
Of course, I'm happy to answer questions about it as well.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back on and talk about it once I've read it. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And obviously, I'm just getting started on my journey of philosophy. Just starting with the basics. I will try my best to catch up and get more delved in. And I'd love to talk again when you get another chance.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.